Welcome to block number 4 of our 2022 mini block of the month quilt. If you've been following along and you've completed blocks 1 through 3, you're already 1/4 of your way through this quilt. And after today, when you've done block number 4, whenever that is, you will be 1/3 of the way through. Now, we all know that 1/3 sounds like it's smaller than 1/4 because 3 is smaller than 4, but an analogy for determining and understanding fractions is if you have a pie and you have sharing it with 3 other people, there's 4 people having a piece of pie, you'll have a smaller piece than if you share it with 3 people, in case you were wondering. Anyway, we're looking at block number 4 today, and I'm going to focus it here. This is our Star Pinwheel, it's called. And as you can see, we've got a spinning thing happening this time. We've been doing blocks so far that are somewhat symmetrical. This one actually has a direction that we're going to notice some different things about. So if we look at the block itself, here's our sample. We're going to deconstruct it a little bit for you so we can see there are 4 blocks that are the same and they're just in a rotating fashion. In this case, they are spinning clockwise, the way the second hand goes around the clock. And we're going to make 4 of these blocks. Just going to destruct it backwards, and then we'll come around and show you how to put it all together. We'll make 4 of the same blocks. So our pattern has instructions for 4 of these A units and 4 of the B units. And we'll construct them as a half square triangle so that they will come out like this. So we will be making 4 of the A and 4 of the B to put it together so that it's like this. Now you'll notice, comparing this to our graphic here, this pinwheel in our pattern is going counterclockwise. But that's because we're looking at the back of the blocks. As you can see, my printer ran out of black ink, and so I ended up with some pink. And this was a previous pattern with different lettering. I think using the A and the B units makes it simpler to follow. So we know we're going to make 4 of the A's and 4 of the B's. That might be less complicated in giving your cutting instructions as well. And we'll talk about cutting in just a few minutes with a couple of photos of the ways that I cut my templates. Again, I would take this pattern apart so that I have all of my 8 pieces of pattern paper that I need, but a second copy will be used to cut off the seam allowance for an A and a B, separate these units, and then use those as our templates. And the cutting instructions will be on your document that's available on our website as well. So, for each of our templates, we will be using a designated size of fabric face down with the dimensions provided. You'll be placing it matching the grain whenever possible and rotating the unit of the template across this section in the manner shown. Simply pause the video at the stage that you are until you've cut the pieces that you need. All right, all of our pieces are stacked up. Isn't it wonderful that there are only 5 sections to work with? 3 for one and 2 in the other. We have them all, as we cut them, face down, the right side down, and the patterns are ready to get together. Got the tools handy here, my folding board, piece of cardboard, cutters that we need. I have the open toe foot set on my machine so I can see the stitching. So we'll start with our segment, our unit. I don't even know what to call it. Unit. I think I like unit. One of our A units. And of course, we're going to start with A1 underneath our folding board and A2 to the right, so we get the crease that we need for our first seam. This is the right angle triangle with a 90-degree angle on the bottom left. We'll take our unit that we cut from the template. It's still right side down, which is the way we always start our first piece in any of our units. So we'll make sure that the angles are going to match up with the position. We have our longest side of the triangle away from the bottom edge. Placing that on there, you can use a little bit of glue or a pin. I'm just going to position it with my fingers because these are so few pieces in our block, and to get started, it just seems simpler for me. Now we notice this triangle that for A2 has a really long, there's a short side on the seam on one end, and we're going to be sewing on this first line from the seam allowance in right to the point, but not into the seam allowance. And there's the line there. We have our longest side that's furthest away from, and the shortest side in the seam allowance. So we'll mark that with a pin so we can tell when we flip it over and we can't see those lines where the shape is going to be underneath what we're working on. I'm going to use a pencil just to mark where this line is, and you can barely see it through the paper, and depending on the type of material that you printed your item on, foundation, it may be more evident. But this is the shape of the triangle that we're going to be sewing on first. So A2 piece was right side down. We'll flip it right side up because when we sew it to unit 1 there, they will be right sides together. So we're going to line this up so this shorter of the two long sides and the longest side are underneath so that it mimics the shape of our paper pattern. And we can position this right sides together with the raw edges even. And when you have a darker and lighter fabric, it's best to slide the darker one just underneath, so if the seams are pressed towards the unit, then the white, it won't show and shadow the white. So we've got that nicely positioned, and we know that the fabric is extending beyond along that shortest side. We'll move these cutters out of the way and get set up, starting in the seam allowance on the raw edge, and we'll go just to the point where all of the seams meet. We'll be coming that way later, so we'll be extending into that, even though the paper may not show it. Depends on how those slash lines printed for your printer. Always trimming the little edges, keep things tidy. It's a good habit to have. So we're going to press this open, and we're pressing to the dark conveniently. That's the way that the construction process has been designed. I've made sure that our seams will be away from the light. In this case, that was an easy task. So I'm just using my quick little hot iron to get a fresh, crisp crease. And the seam allowance is going away from the white, so we didn't really need to worry about shadowing, but it's a good thing to keep in mind whenever you have a darker and lighter fabric, especially with the whites. So we'll put our work to the left of our line that we're going to be sewing next and fold A3 back over that line to create the crease. We can trim with our rotary cutter and ruler on the mat, and if you have a add a quarter ruler, you can use that as well. Make a habit of closing your cutter. All right, so we're going to be looking at the similar type of triangle with the longest side and the shortest side and the not so long side. Again, we can mark with a pin, but it's evident that it's the corner of the pattern because that's the end of it anyway. It's the last one, so it'll be the same shape as the triangle that we have in front of us. The pin at this end isn't really necessary because we can see where the seam is, and we're going to be sewing right off. Pencil mark if that's helpful. Grab our A3 piece. Again, it's right side down. Because of that, the way we cut it, we'll flip it over and look to match the proper edges of the triangle so that they're in the same orientation as our pattern piece. Long side, these shorter sides, and again, we'll just lay that underneath. And I'm going to make sure I can see a little bit of fabric there so I know it's long enough in that direction. The other one will be fine. We've got lots on this side because we have added this 3/8 inch to our template when we prepared the pieces. That gives us some room to scooch. Okay, we'll be sewing from seam allowance to seam allowance, edge, from the raw edge to the raw edge, right through that point this time. Trimming our threads. We'll give this a quick press and then a good heavy press with a bit larger iron and perhaps a little bit of starch or best press type medium, just to give it some stability to maintain all of those fabrics. And then we'll be trimming it up. Now it's set up for our B unit. Nicely, it's just 2 pieces, so it's simple to be able to put together. And for people who are comfortable, well, I wouldn't even really recommend just sewing it without a pattern to sew it to. Even though it's 2 simple pieces, it'll give us the most accurate. We've got our straight of grain for the outside edges of our right angle triangle, and that'll give a good stability. We'll just be very careful with the diagonal when we're sewing our half square triangles. So we'll start with our A piece on the left and our 1 and number 2 on the right, and flip that over to give it a good press. Our number 1 piece is going to be right side down as we cut it with our template. I've indicated on my paper that it's a light. Sometimes the printing doesn't really come out clearly. So we're going to line that up. And if the grain is on your pattern and was cut properly, you'll have the right shape of the pattern for those sides. So again, we'll just leave a 1/4 inch sort of edge there. We only have 2 pieces to deal with. We can see the shape of this B section. And we, of course, cut it with the right side down, so we're going to flip it over in order to sew it right sides up. And we'll look at the shape again. That's our edge of seam allowance. Here's going to be our sewing line, a 1/4 inch in approximately. We can see the shape of this triangle again, being the longest side is on the bottom edge. So we're going to line these raw edges of our piece and ensure that there's a little bit of dark fabric underneath sticking out on the left-hand side of our seam allowance edge. And I didn't pin anything, I'm just going to position it. We do have a bit of room on each edge, so we're just going to line it, and again I'll take care of this dark fabric underneath to make sure that it isn't going to sneak out and show under the white if the seam is pressed to the light. But it should be going the other direction. We'll see how things shape up. So I've hidden away that bit of dark. There's enough fabric on this edge so it's sticking out we can see that those two shapes, the paper triangle and the fabric triangle, are in the same orientation. And we have our raw edge here that are matched up, and the fold is giving us about a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to go right from the raw edge of one to the other into the seam allowances, as we will just be going along these the one time, working so right off to the edge of the paper. All right, we can see that we got a nice clean seam. We're going to flip it over, take a look, and get a little bit of a crease to make sure things look right. All of your units have been prepared and pressed well. We're going to do some squaring up. With a square ruler, I find it easiest because we can do this right angle as we would for squaring up our squares, and we've got a 1/4 inch line along the sewing line and in each direction. There are dots on the top but a straight line on the bottom, so we'll make sure that's perfectly arranged. And with a good firm grasp on your mat, fingers at least touching the mat somewhere, you'll find it much more steady, as sometimes the seam's bulk makes it kind of wobbly. Rotate it so that the longest side is going to be vertical. We can use the 45-degree angle of the ruler on our sewing line and then slide it over so our 1/4 inch line is going to go on the sewing line of the longest side. I have trimmed it by mistake like this. It does happen. It might happen to you, but be careful to be sure that you're going to be edging, taking off the last little bit of the raw edge of the pattern with the dash line. I've left a little bit on the edge here too. I didn't cut the dog ears off just yet. I'm going to leave them on for the purposes of construction, but they can be removed whenever you like. I find it gives me something to match up my pieces. So again, we'll align this B unit so we can do the 90-degree angle with the dots along the top, the line along the bottom, and those are on our sewing line, which is the solid line. The dashed line is the one we're cutting on, and because of the printing, sometimes it might be skewed a little bit. It's best to go with exactly the lines. The sewing line plus a 1/4 inch. And now I'm using the 45 on the top, just conveniently seem to be there, rather than slide it up. Either way works. The 6-inch ruler was really great. So again, I have my the dotted line on the sewing line. I'm going to be adding a 1/4 inch to the seam allowance to ensure the seam allowance and all the angles are precise. The smaller the pieces, the more important these angles are to be accurate. Then we're going to be removing the paper in the opposite construction order. I've scored it with my thumb and then just pull it apart a bit at a time. It perforates nicely. With our A unit, we'll remove the last one added, will be the first one to come off. And we'll score that again, thumbnail. And there'll be less likelihood of damaging any of your stitches in the seam line when you've torn the paper gently with a score. It seems to remove nicely. So I'm just pulling it back, scoring again, close to the seam as I can with thumbnail. and pull it away from the other piece and remove the final one. Each pair of A and B units will be sewn right sides together along this longest edge. And we're going to use not this side but this side on top, simply because the seam is pressed in that direction and it'll be easier to keep track, and there are no seams on the other side to worry about, except at the top when we get started. So I just position it with my fingers and just very gently so as not to stretch any of the weave in the fabric. Because the pieces are small, I feel comfortable doing that, and a pin sometimes can get in the way. Oh, before we go any further, if you didn't notice, my open toe foot is still on the machine. I'm going to have to change that out to the 1/4 inch foot, and then we'll be back after the seams have been sewn. Press your seams away from the bulk of the top of this corner. If you try to press this way, you're going to find it's very, very bulky. So by pressing towards B, we'll just be crossing over that one intersection there, and it'll say stay nice and flat. Make sure you give it a good press, a bit of starch. You'll notice mine is a little askew on the mat, but we can turn that around and just see if we can trim some things down, or we could press it again to stretch things out. But let's take a look at the square, and we'll align our ruler on the 45-degree angle, making sure that we get that nice and crisp right down to the corner where that seam is. And we'll cut the dog ear off. We're going to make sure that that is straight, and this corner here, that dot should be a 1/4 inch. Will give us a 1/4 inch on the side and the top of that intersection. So make sure the dot is right where those seams meet, and that'll give us a really accurate point. We'll trim this a little. There's very little, the dog ear, and a little bit along the top to take off. And we'll rotate it 180 degrees. Again, the pressing was lacking a bit in starch. That would be helpful. It's trying a bit of a rush, I guess. So we got our straight sides here at 2.5 and 2.5. We've got our diagonal line, and we're just going to take a little bit of that top trim off. There's nothing along the right side really to take off. Again, be sure that you have good firm hold on your ruler, because of the bulk of the seams where they meet. It kind of creates a teeter-totter effect. So get some good weight on your ruler. You can hang onto the mat at the same time. Just don't cut your fingers. That'll square it sufficiently. With all of our squares ready, we've got them in place. We're going to fold over the first top right over the top left, and the bottom right over the bottom left, and we'll be sewing straight down the seams one after the other. I've pressed the seams away from these long triangle pieces because of the bulk. When you lay it on your ironing board, you'll notice that they'll want to tend to go that way. If you try to press them this way, it's going to be very difficult and bulky. So press towards the that away from that corner, and I've done the same with this so that they are opposite. So when we're sewing this seam now, they will be nestled, and we can get a very crisp intersection in the center of our pinwheel. So we'll align these edges and gently pinch them together. Again, I'm going to go pinless because of the pieces being so small. I'm comfortable with that. Once your seam is sewn, so that we have all 4 squares together, we're going to lay it out and create a pinwheel effect. These are our nesting seams, and we're going to continue to make this circle with these seam allowances. And by pressing into the center, we're going to be able to work out a little bit of a easing of the bulk in this. And I will attach or include a video for you to use from YouTube that was really helpful and a great resource for future. But once we work this a little bit more, giving it good finger press, we're going to be able to flip it over and see how beautifully they meet in the center. And again, with a bit of best press or spray that you choose, just make sure that you're pressing firmly down with the iron and not moving it around on the piece. And you'll get a good crisp block to add to your block of the month quilt.